Between the 18th and the 19th century, slavery was recognized as a legal practice in North America as in other countries around the world. Today, we are going to present you one of the most cruel and sad events in the history of the United States of America. Slavery in the United States was the legal institution of human chattel slavery that existed in the United States of America in the 18th and the 19th centuries after it gained independence and before the end of the American Civil War. Slavery had been practiced in British North America from early colonial days and was recognized in all the 13 colonies at the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. By the time of the American Revolution in 1775, the status of slaves had already become a caste associated with African ancestry, contributing to a system and legacy in which race played an influential role. At the time the United States Constitution was ratified in 1789, a relatively small number of free people of color were among its voting citizens. During and immediately following the Revolutionary War, abolitionist laws and sentiment began in the northern states. In addition, as most of these states had a higher proportion of free labor, they abolished slavery by the end of the 18th century, some with gradual systems that didn't free the last slave until into the 19th century. But the rapid expansion of the cotton industry in the Deep South after the invention of the cotton gin led the southern states to depend on slavery as integral to their economy. However, the United States was polarized over the issue of slavery, represented by the enslaved and free states, divided by the Mason-Dixon line, which separated free Pennsylvania from enslaved Maryland and Delaware.
Let's continue about how was the slavery in the United States. When the North American continent was first colonized by Europeans, the land was vast and the work was hard, so there was a severe shortage of labor. Men and women were needed to work the land, white-bound servants paying their passages across the ocean from Europe. Though indentured labor eased but didn't solve the problem, early in the 17th century, a Dutch ship loaded with African slaves introduced a solution and a new problem to the New World. Slaves were most economical on large farms, where labor-intensive cash crops such as tobacco could be grown, as we know before. By the end of the American Revolution, slavery had proven unprofitable in the North and was dying out. So, even in the South, the institution was becoming less useful to farmers as tobacco prices fluctuated and began to drop. However, in 1793, Northerner Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. This device made it possible for textile mills to use the type of cotton most easily grown in the South. Cotton replaced tobacco as the South's main cash crop and slavery became profitable again. Although most Southerners owned no slaves at all, by 1860 the South's peculiar institution was inextricably tied to the region's economy. Torn between the economic benefits of slavery and the moral and the constitutional issues it raised, white Southerners grew more and more defensive on the institution. They argued that black people, like children, were incapable of caring for themselves, and that slavery was a benevolent institution that kept them fed, clothed, and occupied. Most Northerners didn't doubt that black people were inferior to whites, but they did doubt the benevolence of slavery. Thank you.
Now we're talking about the life of slave. Daily life for a slave in North Carolina was incredibly difficult. They used to work from sunrise until sunset. Not even children or elderly people were exempt from those long work hours. Besides those long work hours, they weren't supplied with necessary things by slave holders. For example, clothing. Slave mothers often worked to clothe their families at night after long days of labor. Also, something I would like to mention about is the way they were judged when committing something illegal. Slaves were only brought to a slave court for what was considered the most serious crime, such as murder, theft from a white person, or assault on a white person. Something important to say is that one of the few escapes from the severity of slave life was participating in religion. They found ways to be part of these groups. Finally, I will mention about one of area of their life in which slaves were able to exercise some autonomy from their masters. It was creating a family. Slave owners felt it was to their advantage to allow slaves to marry because any children from the marriage would add to their wealth. According to law, a child took on the legal status of its mother. A child born to a slave mother would in turn become a slave even if the father was free. This was just a short summary of slave life, all they had to face and all they have to struggle with.
Treatment of slaves in the United States. The treatment of slaves in the United States varied widely depending on conditions, times, and places. Treatment was generally characterized by brutality, degradation, and inhumanity. Whippings, executions, and rapes were commonplace. Exceptions, however, did exist to virtually every generalization. For instance, there were slaves who employed white workers, slave doctors who treat upper-class white patients, and slaves who rent out their labor. These are not, however, the common rule. Slaves were generally denied the opportunity to learn, to read or write, in order to ensure that they didn't form aspirations that could lead to escape or rebellion. Sexual abuses. Slavery in the United States included frequent rape and sexual abuse of slaves women. Many slaves fought back against sexual attacks, and many died resisting. Others carried psychological and physical scars from the attacks. Sexual abuse of slaves was partly rooted in a patriarchal Southern culture which treated all women, black and white, as property or chattel. Human treatment. After 1820, some slave owners, in response to the inability to import new slaves from Africa, improved the living condition of their slaves in order to induce them to not run away. Some pro-slavery advocates assert that many slaves were content with their situation. African-American abolitionist J. Selah Martin countered that the apparent contentment was merely a physiological reaction to the exceedingly dehumanizing brutality that some slaves experienced, such as witnessing their spouses sold at auction or seeing their daughters raped. Education. Education of slaves was generally discouraged because it was feared that knowledge, particularly the ability to read and write, will cause a slave to become rebellious. In the mid-19th century, enslaving states passed laws making education of slaves illegal. Medical treatment. The quality and extent of medical care received by slaves is not known with certainty. Some historians conclude that the quality was equal to that of whites, because whites were acting to preserve the value of their property, which was limited by the constraints of medical knowledge at the time. Others conclude that the medical care was poor for slaves, and others suggest that the care provided by slaveholders was neglectful, but that slaves often provide their own adequate treatment.
Price of slave controlling for inflation. Price of slave rose dramatically in the sixth decade prior to Civil War, reflecting demand due to commodity cotton, as well as use of slave in shipping and industry. Although the price of a slave relative to indentured servants declined, both got more expensive. Cotton production was rising in relief of the use of slaves to yield high profit. Vogel and Gaiman initially argued that if the Civil War had not happened, the slave price would have increased even more, an average of more than 50% by 1890. Price reflects the characteristics of the slave. Such factors as sex, age, nature, and height were taken into account to determine the price of a slave. Over the life cycle, the price of female slaves was higher than their male counterparts up to the puberty age, as they would likely bear children and produce more slaves, in addition to serving as a laborer. Males around the age 25 were the most valued, as they were at the highest level of productivity and still had a considerable lifespan. If a slave had a history of fire escape, their price was lower, reflecting what planners believed was risk of repeating such behavior. Slave traders and buyers would examine a slave back for whipping scar. A large number of injuries would be seen as evidence of licensing or rebelliousness, rather than the previous master brutally, and would lower the slave price. Tall and small slaves were priced at a higher level, as hay was viewed as a proxy for fitness and productivity. The condition of the market led to show in the supply and demand of slaves, which in turn changed price. For instance, slaves became more expensive after the decrease in supply caused by the ban on importation of slaves. In 1808, the market for the product of the world also affected slave economic value. Demand for slaves fell with the price of cotton. In 1840, anticipation of change also had a high influence on price. As the Civil War progressed, there was great doubt that slavery would continue to be legal. In prime malls in New Orleans were sold at $1,160 in 1862 to the $1,381 in 1870 and 1861.
The end of the slavery. It's incredible how the people were mistreated just because they were of different skin color. The slaves made up a majority of the population in some states. They were very important in the economy because they worked very hard, and that's why United States had big earnings. The slavery ended in 1863 when the President Lincoln signed and created a new law where announced the end of slavery. But 2 years and a half after, all the slaves were freed, and they celebrated the Slavery Day in June 1865. And this date is still celebrated. That is the date when the history finally took a huge change.
The 13th Amendment is based on American Civil War. As the Third Amendment says, gaining equal rights as citizens has been a long and drawn-out process for African Americans. Learn how the 13th Amendment started this process by eliminating the institution of slavery. In 1864, Congress began looking at several ideas to end slavery. The Senate Judiciary Committee assumed control of the legislation and eventually drafted a constitutional amendment that went before the Senate for approval, passing there on April 8, 1864, in an overwhelming majority of 38-6. The presidential elections of 1864 brought Lincoln back to the White House along with Republican majorities in both legislative bodies. On January 31, 1865, the amendment passed in the United States House of Representatives by votes of 119 to 76 votes above the necessary two-thirds majority. Many people think that the Emancipation Proclamation resulted in the total abolition of slavery. While the Emancipation Proclamation did free some slaves, the 13th Amendment called for the total abolition of slavery. It was the primary piece of the legislation that permanently ended the institution of slavery in the United States, and it was passed in the 1865 and was ratified in December 8, 1865. With the passage of the amendment, the peculiar institution that had indelibly shaped American history was eradicated.